for joining us this evening. This has been a wonderful collaboration started in the fall of thinking about some of the issues that we collectively talk about in the global health and international development communities. And ethical experiences and our ethical lens is often one that comes up and is one that many of you have raised to us that you wanted to have more discussions on. So I'd like to thank the Departments of International Development Studies and the Department of Stephen Baranyi at IWK Health Authority. And I'm Shauna O'Hearn, Director of Global Health. So the three of us coordinated together to be able to bring Rebecca Tiessen to back home, I like to say. So many of you may know Rebecca. She was here for a number of years as faculty within the IDS department and held some other adjunct appointments as well. And has really helped us as a global community think about what is our role as volunteers, what is our role in international development, and for many of us thinking about it from a health lens as well. So we're very honored to have you here today, journeying from cold Ottawa to warmer Halifax, and we may keep her a little bit longer depending on what weather is like tomorrow. So stay tuned, everyone. There might be a follow-up talk with Rebecca tomorrow night over a beer or something. So which would be nice. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Rebecca. Thank you and welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Shauna, and thank you, Heather and Nissim, for coordinating this opportunity for me to be here today. Can everyone hear me okay? I think there's a good enough projection in the room. All right, this is wonderful. This is indeed a nice return for me to my favorite city in Canada, and not just because of the fantastic weather you have here, but because I have so many friends and colleagues and former students that I stay in touch with. And this is where this research started. So it's been really a nice journey. I've moved away from Halifax in 2007, and I try to come back as often as I can. This is such a nice opportunity now to be able to share some of the work that I've been doing since I've left and work I started while I was here. So some of you maybe have to leave a little bit early, and that's cool. So I'll give you the punchline. The punchline is international volunteering can be highly valuable, and it can contribute immense insights and deliver skills and build capacity, and it can transform your life, and it can change the lives of other people with whom you interact. So that's the punchline. I think that there's a lot of potential, and within the parameters of good ethical practice, international volunteering can have a really solid impact on the kinds of work that we want to do, particularly when we're talking about international development work. So I have been an international volunteer, so maybe that's why I have that perspective, but I haven't always had that perspective. I've been an international volunteer 3 times, having done some work in Malawi, also in Zimbabwe, and I plan to do more international volunteering in the year ahead, actually. On my sabbatical, I'll be doing some international volunteer work. But I also volunteer with my daughter's school. I volunteer with community groups. I volunteer with some of the sports activities that my kids do. And so to me, volunteering is what makes the world go round. And there's a lot of negative press that we're seeing around international volunteering, and I want to address some of that. How many of you in this room have been or are volunteers? Yeah, this is something that is probably part of your day-to-day life on a regular basis. How many of you have volunteered internationally? A large number of you have done international volunteering, and that's really great. So you bring a lot of experiences, a lot of your own examples, and I too have spent a lot of time talking to people about their experiences. In fact, when I first started doing this research, it was because I was talking to students who had gone abroad on an internship where they were doing a volunteer placement, sometimes for credit, sometimes not for credit, coming back and having these life-changing experiences with no real space to talk about their experiences and to share what they'd learned. In some cases, people came back with frustrations and concerns about the kind of volunteering that they participated in. So as I started to see these different experiences, I had questions about what is the state of the field beyond these anecdotes that we're hearing. Some of these images might resonate with you. They might look like the kind of volunteer experience you had or have in your home communities. And some of these images may not. And I want to really take some time to reflect on this, what one of my colleagues calls the visual economy of international volunteering and the impact that it has on how these images create certain tropes and stereotypes. So one of the great things then about doing research on international volunteering is that it resonates with so many people, right? So, oh, you do work on international volunteering. I'll often hear someone say, I know someone, my neighbor's daughter just came back from Nepal where she spent 6 weeks as a volunteer. I just finished a survey with returned international volunteers, and we're looking at returned international volunteers in Canada and the kinds of contributions that they make in their home communities. What kind of impact has the international volunteer experience had on them as citizens in Canada? And such really great information that we've received from people of a whole range, age range. And I got a call from one fellow who's called up and he says, I'm 82 years old and I really want to do your survey because I also was an international volunteer more than 5 decades ago. But unfortunately, my computer is about 5 decades old and I'm not able to get online and do the survey. And so he chatted with me for a bit about his own experience and told me about what a life-changing opportunity it was for him and how it shaped his career path, how he went into working for the Canadian International Development Agency, how he continued to volunteer throughout the course of his life locally, but also returning overseas to do some work. So those kinds of stories are really great, and that is one of the wonderful things about doing this research. Of course, one of the challenges of doing this research is that because everyone has a story, those stories often don't reflect the broad themes that we need to really explore. And as a lot of popular media now will portray, there's some of the headlines of newspaper articles, for example, international volunteers do more harm than good, or Volunteers Unleashed, for example. These kinds of these headlines are shaping the way that we start to talk about international volunteering, and I want to break that down a little bit. All right, so popular media critiques. Has anyone seen this documentary? Yeah, quite a few of you. Maybe you've seen it in a class. If you haven't seen it, you can watch it online. It's a CBC documentary. I mean, even the title of it alone, Volunteers Unleashed, it tells a particular story about what you might expect. So this documentary covers the overseas volunteering and how it has been privatized, gone mainstream, attracting millions of young people, follows volunteers to South America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, showing how voluntourism has become the fastest growing and the most controversial travel sector. So right in this summary, you can see the conflation, right, of international volunteering and volunteering overseas with voluntourism. So one of the challenges that we face in this field of research is people tend to throw everything into the same basket, right, when they're talking about international volunteering or volunteering overseas. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to dissect and to differentiate along the lines of the different program modalities, because there's a lot of variation within them. So HuffPost had an article, When Volunteering Abroad Does More Harm Than Good, and I'm often called up to do an interview, maybe with a student newspaper, or CBC The Current was going to do something on international volunteering, and I'm always excited about the opportunity to talk about international volunteering. And then usually that first question comes up. What do you think? Is voluntourism good or bad? And I thought, I thought you were going to ask me about international volunteering. I didn't know that's what you wanted to talk about was voluntourism. So even just the language of voluntourism, this concept is really interesting. And so I want to come back to that in a minute when I start to break down the different categories. All right, so some of the critiques, and we're hearing lots of them, these critiques that international volunteering, volunteerism can do more harm than good. And some of this is captured really well in some fascinating culture jamming activities. So you might see memes or cartoons, or this video that I suppose some of you have seen. It's just a 3-minute video that I'll show you. Who wants to be a volunteer?
To be a volunteer. The show that's putting you on the front lines. I'm here with Lily, who's all the way from Europe, and she's one question away from winning the grand prize, a chance to save Africa. Lily, how are you feeling?
I'm quite proud of myself. I didn't think I'd make it.
Well, you pulled through well. Let's not waste any more time. Lily, are you ready?
I was born ready.
Let's play. Who wants to be a volunteer? For the grand prize of a chance to save Africa. Answer this question. How many countries are there in Africa? A, 1, 2, C, 5, or D, 54.
I know I should know this one. I just can't remember.
This is the final question. You can't make it say now.
I'll use my last line.
You want to use the Call an African Child Life Line. Well, if you help them so much, let's see if they can help you. Hello, Michael.
What's up, man?
Michael, I'm sitting with Lily. She's one question away from saving Africa. She needs your help. Lily, time starts now.
Michael, how many countries are in Africa? Is it A, 1, B, 2? Michael? Michael?
I think it's frozen.
What was the question again? How many countries are in Africa?
Well, Lily, we're almost out of time now. If you don't know the answer, you're just going to have to guess.
Okay. A, 1.
Final answer.
Yes.
Well, Lily, looks like you're going to have to pack your bags. But you're not going home. You're going to go save Africa. Who wants to be a volunteer?
So this is part of the Rusty Radiator series that started with a Norwegian group with a bunch of South Africans who decided to send radiators to Norway to save them because it's so cold, and they felt that this need to help those poor people who suffer all that cold weather. So this culture jam is a great example of mocking some of these common tropes. The idea of saving Africa, for example, and the idea that you don't have to know anything and you can still make a huge splash. You can do so much. This is humor, but there are some truths to it, and that's why I think this, as a culture jamming example, is really effective. In fact, when I was doing interviews with some of the Canadian youth many years ago now, one of the participants in my study said, I don't want to know anything about the country I'm going to. I want to go with a blank slate. I don't want to have any stereotypes, any misconceptions. I want to go in and learn and discover on my own. And then she proceeded to say something to the effect like, I'm going to Kenya, so I don't know, is it a French-speaking country? And I was very worried about this young woman and her lack of knowledge. But again, I have to say that these are like very few, these examples. The vast majority of the young people I talked to back, these were telephone calls, phones looked like this, and I would hang up and I would think, man, I hope my kids grow up to be like these young people. For the most part, these are young, thoughtful, hardworking, and dedicated people who are really trying to do the most that they can to address important issues in their lives and to work in solidarity with other communities to make a difference. So, oops, I shouldn't have done it like that. All right. But indeed, these stereotypes can harm dignity, and they can also, and we have a responsibility to challenge those perceptions. But I think also the stereotype of the international volunteer, if it's pitched in this kind of light, also can, those sorts of stereotypes are also harmful, and they don't accurately reflect the diverse kinds of experiences that people have. So one of the things that I like to say is that this kind of approach doesn't let facts get in the way of a good argument. And as a researcher, I want the evidence to support strong arguments. And so this is why I've been really, asking a lot of the questions about, does this resonate with the kinds of experiences that people are having? And in particular, what are host organizations saying about their experiences receiving these international volunteers? The challenge first is to get past this imprecision in the kinds of programs that we're talking about. So, of course, we do have, keeping in mind all of these problems that exist within a growing economy of the for-profit, volunteer-sending organizations that are using opportunities to send young people abroad as a way to make money. And while that is a challenge, and it is a growing problem in some ways, we are seeing some progress and some positive work being done. So I don't know if you've heard of Orphan Tourism, but this image here is part of another kind of culture jamming activity. It's maybe the image isn't very clear, but there's a glass box and there's two small children inside the glass box, and then there's three photographers surrounding the box taking pictures. And the point is that children aren't tourist attractions, and think before visiting an orphanage. In fact, that documentary, Volunteers Unleashed, has 3 segments. One of the segments is a really shocking story about British journalists who traveled to an orphanage and asked if they could take a few of the children out of the orphanage for the day to just spend the day with them. So it was a woman and 2 men, and the orphanage said, sure. And he lined up all of the children along the fence, and the journalists that had they brought they had a little spy camera or a small camera, undetectable, recorded this entire process, and they chose 3 children from along the fence, packed them in their car, and drove away. And so, these examples are horrifying. There's another one I talked about this morning when I was meeting with the medical doctors down the road about a young man who couldn't get into medical school, 18 years old, and decided to get some practical experience that would help him get into medical school. And in his responsibilities, he was helping a locally based surgeon, perform surgery, and with no training and no skills, while supervised by an actual surgeon, was actually performing the surgery. At the same time, another young Westerner in the room fainted, and the surgeon had to leave the patient and go attend to this other Westerner in the room, compromising the health and the safety of the woman for whom the surgery was taking place. So these are really, really hardcore bad examples of volunteerism in really, problematic examples. But that isn't the general experience that I've seen. In fact, when it comes to volunteerism, people often ask me about volunteerism, my thoughts on it, and my first reaction is pick one. Is it volunteering or is it tourism? Like, why does it have to be both, right? So I think that there's a lot of scope first for just thinking about why do we even use this language of voluntourism? Does it adequately reflect in any way the kind of volunteer abroad work that fits even the most simple guidelines for effective practice? International volunteering is often used to describe programs that are linked to the Volunteer Cooperation Program, often funded by governments. In Canada, the Canadian government funds usually about a dozen NGOs, nonprofit NGOs, to provide volunteer abroad programs. In other countries, there are government programs that are built right into the government activities. So there are different models of how that happens around the world, but there's a screening process. But the most important thing that's typical of the Volunteer Cooperation Program, the most important component, I think, is that the volunteers only go to host partners that have created a request for technical assistance. So there's a demand, and the volunteer partner organization in Canada, for example, is able to fill that demand if they have the right candidate. So if the applications come in and the person has the skills that meet the needs of the partner organization, they're able to make a match. Whereas a lot of the voluntourism is really about shopping, right? You can choose, where do you want to go? How long do you want to go? What do you want to do when you're there? You like monkeys? Pet a monkey, you can come. So there's lots of problems around the rationale for those programs. All right, so international volunteering is, the majority of the work that we do and the partner organizations that we interview talk about the professional international volunteers. Those are non-students. These are people who come who are maybe skilled professionals. Some of them have had an entire career working in a particular area and have retired and now are volunteering and using their years of experience in the work that they do abroad. But sometimes students are also part of international volunteering programs, and they may take part through internships or co-op placements in international volunteer placements. On the importance of research. So what this does is it helps us move beyond that single narrative of international volunteering does more harm than good. It also gives us some of that evidence we need to support a strong argument, allows us to test some of the initial conclusions. And I have to admit, international volunteering and my research on this has been evolving over time. Some of the early conclusions that I drew from my research, as I did more and more research and started to talk to the partner organizations, it became clear that the arguments that I was making weren't the same perspective held by the host organizations. So there's a lot of really critical literature around neo-colonialism, for example, and neo-imperialism, that these are valid critiques that talk to the structural challenges that we have to address, but they weren't reflecting the agency and voice of the host organizations. And so as I've done more research, I've started to better, I think, represent some of the experiences that the partner organizations have had. So initial conclusions, going back to some of those and really being open to hearing what the partner organizations are saying. To do this requires a different kind of research process, and it's one that's much more collaborative in nature. It means working much more closely with some of the partner organizations in Canada, WUSC, CUSO, a number of the volunteer sending organizations, in order to ensure that we're able to access those organizations that are receiving international volunteers, but also to help design the research and to ensure that the research that we're designing and the findings that we have are useful for those organizations. Because a lot of those organizations, I meet with them on a regular basis. WUSC and CUSO in particular, I work closely with. They're learning organizations. They'll come to conferences, they'll hear our critiques, they'll listen, they might not agree with all of the arguments that we're making. Maybe they don't feel that it reflects the kind of work that they're doing in some instances, but they're learning organizations and they take that information very seriously and they use it to shape their programs and try and develop better programs, better pre-departure training, and so on. A lot of the collaborative work that we do is also with international volunteer organizations in the Global South or volunteer receiving organizations. And more trying to work with locally based researchers who have more control over the entire research process. So we're trying to identify and work with some of the students and researchers in the partner countries to help us design the interview questions, survey questions, to conduct the research, to analyze the research, and to have full ownership of the findings by publishing the work just in their own name, even though, I mean, there's always that I could add my name to any of those publications. We often don't. We allow them to have full ownership of the research, which is an important, for me, an important approach that I can take at this stage in my career. So back in 2005, when I was here, I did a pilot study, students just coming to my office, talking to me about their experiences. I said, let's do a few test interviews. Between 2007 and 2011, IDRC funded a project that Dr. Barbara Heron at York University and I did. In fact, a lot of the work that comes out of that study I still draw on because a lot of research leads to more research, right? So a lot of the assumptions and analytical frames that I had developed through that research, I've challenged and continue to use. In fact, that research really culminated in the book. I have a few copies here if anyone's interested in taking one home. So that IDRC-funded project allowed us to do interviews with Canadian youth, but also about 180 interviews in 7 partner countries. We hired locally based researchers to collect that data, and then later in 2017, we hired local researchers to analyze the data and write journal articles out of that research. In 2014, our study expanded to looking at effective practices more broadly, and so we're just wrapping up that study, and I'm going to talk about some of the findings from that today. And this ongoing research we're doing right now, we're just finalizing the report for employment and social development. On that study I talked about trying to understand what have been the impacts of international volunteers. Does it make them better Canadian citizens? What do they do at home? And in fact, really, you know, I'm thinking of some of the really great stories that I'm seeing from that research. But fascinating things that people have talked about in terms of how international volunteering has shaped their global citizenship identity, their desire for cross-cultural engagement, the way that they raise their children, the kinds of schools they send their kids to, the sort of programs that they do, the sponsoring of newcomers to Canada, all sorts of activities that are really interesting. And what we're trying to do is compare that to the GVP, something like that. It's the national survey on Canadian volunteering in Canada to see, do international volunteers volunteer more or better or give more than the national average? And so we can see that in fact there is a correlation. There is international volunteers tend to be more generous with donations. They're much more likely to support ODI, overseas development assistance. And to be engaged in cross-cultural experiences. And hopefully in the future I'll continue to dig into some of the more thematic areas that I'll talk about at the end of this presentation. So there are 4 main themes, I guess, that come out of some of my studies over the last several years. And the first one is around cross-cultural engagement. I think it is the big one. This is the, you know, there's so much interesting material around cross-cultural engagement, both positive and negative. I'll talk a bit about that. Skills development, skills transfer, skills sharing, adventure, and the 4th is helping or having an impact. Keeping in mind there are different lengths of time for these programs, different objectives, and possibilities and opportunities for reciprocity and mutuality. So, cross-cultural engagement. This is certainly the one that's identified as the most common rationale or motivation for participating in international volunteering. It's also the one that really shines when we talk to people about what impact international volunteering has had. It's often linked to global citizenship identities and is seen to have some really long-term impacts on the experiences that people want to share. There's some interesting thoughts and reflections that we heard from both the international volunteers and also from the host organizations around cross-cultural understanding and global competency that comes as a result of these interactions. And one of the things that was really useful to observe was the language that we use around culture shock. So we asked our volunteer partner organization interviewees to reflect on whether they observed international volunteers going through that diagram. You know, the one that's the U, right? The pre-departure U that you may have seen. You know, do you see international volunteers come and they're on a bit of a high, but then, you know, they start to get kind of bummed. Maybe they're homesick, maybe they get sick. And that's about halfway through, and then as they're starting to leave, they're starting to get excited about going home, and maybe some of their projects are coming to an end, and you can see that their moods, their emotional state is improving. So we often use this U curve as the culture shock curve. So we talked about that, and we used that tool when we did our interviews. And it was surprising to us at the time, and now I've been talking about it for so long, it's not a surprise. The host organizations were really frustrated with this language of culture shock. Like, so they come and they find our culture shocking? Like, that seems really harsh. And then they started to say things, well, we find their culture really shocking too. And sometimes they show up for work in tank tops and shorts. And so there's all sorts of interesting insights that came up around that particular language. But they had some really useful suggestions around challenges with cultural adaptation and other ways that we can talk about it without being offensive. So all of this helps us understand how we can engage better in a cross-cultural context. Overall, both the international volunteers and host organizations see a cross-cultural experience as mutually beneficial. There's a lot of value associated with learning about how, in Canada, the sort of priorities that our government has and what sort of funding is available, and how working together they can learn about different styles and approaches and be more effective in the work that they do. And a lot of importance that surrounded the idea of reciprocity. So a cross-cultural experience is something that is shared, and unlike other kinds of benefits that might arise from international volunteering, the cross-cultural component was something that was important to both groups. Skills development and skills transfer, interestingly, the host organizations don't talk about skills transfer. That's a language that we tend to use. They talk about skills sharing or sharing skills, and I think that speaks volumes too, right? So if you're talking about transferring skills, being more effective, it's much more effective that skills transfer. It's much more effective from the host organization's perspective when you're working with locally based volunteers or students or staff members in a way that builds the capacity of people locally. So we see a much higher success rate of skills adaptation, adoption of skills when there's a better sustainability in place. So when there's local volunteers involved, there's capacity being built so that when the volunteer leaves, those skills are sustained in the organization. And also the importance of, this is where that multi-directional transfer of skills is important here, the idea of sharing, that there's importance associated with learning about skills that can be derived from the experience of being in another country. Highly skilled volunteers was correlated with much higher organizational positive outcomes. So while we often think about length of time as an important variable for going abroad, and in fact, this is something that I have argued in some of my writing. We've had host organizations say that 6 months is a minimum. That should be the minimum amount of time. So I spent years in giving talks saying, if you want to go abroad, the host organizations say, come for 6 months. That should be your minimum. And a lot of people, I could see them like, there's no way I'm going to go for 6 months. My mom would never let me go, or it would interfere with my schooling, or with my ability to pay back my student loans, a number of different reasons. And when it comes to learning, Indeed, 6 months still is, 6 months or more is still considered very effective from the partner organization's perspective. If you're going there to learn, if you're not going and you're not transferring a particular skill set, then, and there are skills, of course, that you can bring, but if you're not going to teach, say, some accounting skills, for example, that are going to be highly valued by that organization. If you're going there primarily to learn, then the longer you're there, the better. And of course, that iceberg analogy is really important, right? Because after living in Malawi for 2 years, at around the 6-month mark, I was starting to get really confident. Like, I'm really understanding how things work around here. And by the time I left after 2 years, I realized I only saw that tip of the iceberg. Like, now I realized, that was the point where I realized that there was all this stuff happening underneath the water. I didn't know what it was, I didn't know how to understand it, but I knew at least that it was there and that I didn't know what I didn't know. So applicable skills were considered more important overall than level of education of the volunteers, and the short-term volunteers were considered, generally speaking, in their experience, more skilled and more effective. Adventure is an important rationale for a lot of the international volunteers going abroad. And even though when asked, what were some of your motivations for going overseas, I would say, that wasn't a big thing that stood out. It's something, oh, I'm going because I want an adventure. But it's the other kinds of conversations that came up that helped really identify this important motivation that a lot of the international volunteers had. And adventure is important. I mean, you're not going to go overseas and pack up your life and leave your family and friends and live in another country for several weeks, several months, several years if you don't have some sense of adventure. So this collage of photographs is a good depiction of the kinds of things that you'd see if you just Googled international volunteering, right? These are the sort of images that stand out. A lot of it involves doing fun things, safaris, climbing mountains, touching animals. This one always makes me laugh because I think if you want to be cold and see snow, just come to Ottawa. I'm not sure why that image is even there. How is that even a marketing strategy?
Maybe that is Ottawa.
Maybe that is Ottawa. It's the Gatineau Hills. It could well be. So look, adventure, if you think about the visual economy of some of the marketing strategies, this is really an important aspect of looking at that. But the host organizations talked about adventure and the role of the fact that international volunteers do come with a sense of adventure. They actually really appreciate it. And so while we might, in pre-departure training, might say, look, you're going there to work, don't be thinking about holidays and things like that. You're meant to be working while you're there. That's true. The point is that timing is everything. So the host organizations have no problem with your adventure, no problem. Actually, they appreciate that you would like to see their country and enjoy all of the beauty that their country has to offer. But they want you to be reflecting on, the kinds of demands that exist within the organization. So a lot of things came up around, the volunteers' parents are coming for a visit and they're in the middle of a major grant application, and the volunteer who's assigned to do that grant application goes off for 2 weeks and has holiday with their parents. So those kinds of issues did come up. But adventure is an important rationale that does shine through a lot of the interview responses, and it's one of the chapters in that book. And then the last of those 4 themes is having an impact, or the helping imperative. So in Barbara Herron's book, Desire for Development, she really deals with this idea of the helping imperative and what it means to have this helping imperative in the context of a neo-colonial process of engagement. Helping is a range of activities and a range of perspectives that people have. And the host organizations highlight a number of ways that international volunteers are able to help. And sometimes it's around small contributions that are made or small skills that are brought. But most often it was around the fresh insights and the new ideas that international volunteers bring to the work that they're doing. And I can't downplay that enough. This is really valuable to our partner organizations, to have people come who aren't familiar with the day-to-day things that the organization does, who can come in and just think outside of what they, the box, thinking outside of the sorts of things that they would normally be thinking about, bring in some new ideas. Whether they're adopted or not is some, that's a different matter. But the fact that that new energy is brought to the work gives people a sense of desire to continue and to keep working on their projects, and that dedication to really making a difference in people's lives that gave the host organizations that spark to continue doing the work that they're doing. Of course, we have to understand this in the context of, as Barbara Heron talks about, these neo-colonial practices, the way in which helping is often done within a context of othering. Nancy Cook's work talks about this in greater detail too, reflecting on the way that the freed selves are seeking opportunities to save the marginalized other. One of the final points on the helping imperative that I found really interesting is that a lot of my international volunteer participants in this study identified their role as a helper in relation to being a role model. That they felt that because of their empowered ways as young women with education, they were able to be effective role models for the young women and girls that they encountered in the work they were doing. And this raised a bunch of interesting questions for me, how problematic this could be. Some of the quotes were things such as, I think I have them here, being a good example to local women, coaching local people to take action on gender inequality, okay, fine. But this one, showing women it is okay to talk to the boss and stand up for yourself. So this can in fact be a very effective way of serving as a role model. But there are, of course, very important ethical implications of what happens when the volunteer is not there, for example, to see it through, or what kind of retribution might exist for the young woman who might speak up to her boss with that kind of coaching and might face all sorts of consequences. So of course there are some really valuable ethical issues surrounding that. And I became very skeptical and critical of this idea of role models, this idea that the vast majority at the time of international volunteers were women, are women, and that's changing. It's more and more people coming from all diverse backgrounds that are participating in international volunteering. So the idea of white privilege is insufficient for our analysis, but it's still something that is worth reflecting on. And it helps us understand this idea that international volunteering and voluntourism in particular is shaped around this trope of saving women and girls. In fact, just doing a search for international volunteer opportunities, you'll see a lot of references in the taglines. Get involved, you can save women and girls. And some of these are important for creating change for marginalized women and girls. Some opportunities here for finding solutions that can empower women and girls. And so there's a lot of different programs that one can participate in. But a lot of this, this comes back to Ellen Kloss's idea of that, the imagery and the Madonna Complex, for example, and some of the other feminist scholarship on this. So Kloss talks about the Madonna Complex. This is the idea of the white woman, white virgin woman sitting surrounded by children, right? And a Google search of international volunteering is going to show a lot of those images as well. A lot of white women with babies on their back, basically a lot of white women with children. And what this does is it creates this binary of there are two types of people in the world. There's the good savior white volunteer, and there's the helpless, poor black child, and that the rest of the world doesn't exist, right? There are no other adults that they're interacting with, and it infantilizes, it suggests that the developing world is devoid of any adults, right? And so it perpetuates some of this paternalism. So Cook talks about it in the context of the free cells of the international volunteers, that they're empowered women versus the subjugated women that they encounter that are in need of being saved and to be freed from their cultural constraints. Some of it, the literature helps us understand gender hierarchies and the way that, interestingly, international volunteers as women are able to transgress gender norms. They're able to go into other contexts as white women because of their education and privilege and status and maybe the color of their skin and what they might represent in terms of potential funding, are able to interact with men in some instances that locally based women are not able to interact. And so women actually can become de facto men in those spaces and be able to navigate spaces that local women are unable to navigate. And then the critical feminist scholarship also reminds us that we have to understand and be in tune with the subaltern perspectives and create space for those perspectives to be shared more effectively beyond this kind of navel gazing that we do in a lot of our research about the white privileged. I mean, we're further privileging the white privilege by only reflecting on the white privileged volunteer. So that is an inherent challenge in that kind of research project. So the most recent research that we've been looking at is some data that's come in just over the last few months from Malawi, Kenya, and Uganda. And the purpose of this study was to look at the same kinds of questions that we had around role models. And there was a variety of questions. One of the questions that some of you might find really interesting, one of the questions is, what do you think about a feminist international assistance policy? And is this something that you think is that a language that you can use in your day-to-day work? Do you see problems with the language of doing feminist work? That's for another day, that discussion. This particular focus was on what are host organizations saying about role models and international volunteers serving as role models. And so now a lot of the interviews that we've done are really critical of international volunteers. Hiring locally based researchers has allowed us to avoid to some extent that polite bias that you would get. So if I was there and I said, so, I understand you accept international volunteers. Tell me, what do you think about hosting international volunteers? Well, of course, they might say what they think I want to hear, which is maybe a positive story. Very mixed findings in terms of some of the pros and the cons of hosting international volunteers. And one of the, there are examples of, in Malawi in particular, where some of our colleagues in the transcripts you can see that they've expressed deep concerns for the international volunteer who comes in and thinks that he's the boss and all he does is tell us what to do and never listens to us and never learns from us. There are, of course, those critiques. So going in knowing that there are some really interesting critical reflections that are happening with our volunteer partner organizations, we asked them to reflect on this, on whether or not international volunteers are serving as role models, and what does that mean? And that helps us dig in a little bit deeper about the effective contributions of international volunteers within at least one of the SDGs on gender equality. So as I'm reviewing the transcripts now, I'm starting to code them looking at these three different categories of gender equality measurement that help us understand a little bit about the impact. And so we're starting to reflect on this, and I'm hoping to do some metadata analysis of the evaluations that volunteer partner organizations do routinely to try to track a little bit better what is the kind of impact that international volunteers are having on gender equality related work. So I see them in three categories: high, medium, and low impact. Or I think a better language here is around high impact is that transformational. Is the international volunteer playing a role in transforming the attitudes and behaviors in those communities in partnership with and in solidarity with those who are locally based and fighting for those same kinds of social justice changes? A medium impact, which draws on Moser's argument of practical and strategic needs, right? So yeah, it's got a medium impact in terms of gender equality measurement. It's addressing some of the practical needs that women have, maybe a certain kind of education or a skill development, but it's also linked to policy and advocacy change so that laws are changed that allow women to work in spaces that they're not currently allowed to work in. And then a low impact is kind of an entry point. You know, these are programs that target women to address very practical needs. Let's just, provide sewing machines and some training, and women can start sewing clothing, and potentially there's a market for it, and we don't really know what the broader impact is going to be. These are useful categories, but what's I think the most useful in the analysis is looking at how one impact is leading to the other, if it is. So one of the things that we're really looking for here is, we have gender equality programs that we're working on. We're providing skills that allow women, we're providing educational opportunities for girls to go to school. And through these programs, we have seen that teachers are now changing their attitude about whether or not girls should come to school. And teachers are now supporting girls coming to school. So we're looking for how these different ideas link between, the linkages between them. So some examples of low gender equality impact that can include coordinating group activities, being aware and sensitive to gender dynamics. There might be some gender mainstreaming programs that the organization does and gets some funding as a result. Improving women's economic opportunities. A lot of the stuff that you would find in a lot of the policy documents, like even the Feminist International Assistance Policy, a lot of those things are really targeted at very basic entry point work around including women, giving women access to education, providing economic opportunities for women, all of which can have medium and high impact, but don't necessarily on their own. Some of them talked about the importance of having techno-savvy international volunteers come and help them just use the internet to search for tools for business expansion. And even just forms of training and education in research methods, for example, were seen as some valuable but low impact activities. The more medium impact activities had to do with finding opportunities for women to take on leadership roles, the role models that came in were supporting local women, championing issues that the women felt were really important. They assisted with the establishment of advocacy groups that addressed gender inequality in the workplace, so there was an educational component, but also beyond that, a spirit of changing the practices within the organization, and other advocacy campaigns and activities that they'd addressed. In terms of higher impact, we saw some examples of educated international volunteers who were motivating local women going back to school and tracking how this had now turned into a new set of skills that the women had that led to economic independence and the value that those women associated with that economic independence, the way it changed their own attitudes about what they're able to do and how they can live their lives. Breaking out of societal and gender boundaries. Male international volunteers, this came up a lot, and it is really, really interesting. I have a caveat about it, but male international volunteers were seen as highly effective role models when they were breaking gender roles or transgressing gender norms in other societies. So this could be through promoting women's participation in activities, promoting a feminist approach, even just doing activities that are not typically part of the gender division of labor in other cultural contexts was seen as an opportunity to think about why things are done the way they are done and start to challenge some of the perspectives, attitudes, and behaviors that people had. And what this often led to, which had a high gender equality impact, was the local leaders in those communities were starting to model some of those positive changes that contributed to gender equality norms in those society. So that the leadership was, that the role models played a role in changing the leadership strategies, but it was changing from within much more effectively as locally as leaders became those role models. So there's some other evidence here of different ways that breaking gender norms and men's participation in gender roles that are generally ascribed to women were seen as really effective ways of doing role modeling. The caveat that I have about this is one, well maybe two of them, that very few of the international volunteers are actually men. Like it's mostly women who are doing international volunteering. And so the fact that there's sort of this overemphasis on the role that men can play in terms of gender equality is, perhaps something that needs to be addressed, definitely needs to be addressed. But the other is that, gender equality and feminist principles sometimes only, very frustratingly so, only resonate with people when they come from men, right? And so it's so difficult for us to try and promote gender-sensitive work as women, and the fact that this comes up in those discussions, that it's really only men that can make gender equality, I guess, a viable solution or possible in their own lives. So challenging that is a next step, and finding ways to have conversations with communities about how international volunteers who are women, who might also be transgressing some of the gender norms in society, and can talk about experiences of how men also participate in a range of activities and serve as role models. So just some, interesting things around how men model alternative behavior, but also just more and more as organizations are focusing on engaging men and boys through the educational process, how important that has been and how much that has inspired communities to engage in, or to promote and to recognize alternative masculinities in those communities. So the promotion of fathers groups, a lot of mothers groups exist in a lot of communities. But the host organizations talked about the value that the international volunteers played in starting up fathers groups that involve fathers in reflecting on educating their daughters and the kinds of experiences and life opportunities that they want for girls in their community. And, as one person said, international volunteers are changing that mindset of saying that the kitchen is for girls, so that's being wiped out. And it also tells us a lot about, it gives us a perspective that brings in the voice, the agency, the subaltern perspectives that highlight the different considerations and contributions that international volunteers make. And I think what's fascinating about hearing the voices of the partner organizations in all this is that it's a much richer analysis of the nuanced reflections on gender equality than I think the literature suggests. So through more research like this, I think we would be able to tap into a lot more examples and scenarios of how gender equality impacts are being made in communities beyond the kind of critiques that we maybe use. So I highlighted that already. So coming back to, all of this is around the ethical principles of doing good international volunteer work and thinking about the different modalities that have some have much more built-in ethical guidelines than others. What does it mean for institutions and organizations and universities, for example? And how can they do a better job of ensuring that they're accountable to some of these ethical principles of good international volunteer practice? One of the things that Kareem Haji and Pamela Roy and Bob Goff have talked about is the importance of mobility inequality and trying to change the way that we talk about international volunteering as exchange programs, right? There's often very little exchange that actually happens. Some programs are built around the idea of exchange, and there are a few of them. So their argument is that we have to keep in mind that mobility is indeed such a privilege, and that there's a lot of inequality in that process. So there's a lot that can be done through internationalization at home, and with the large number of international students that we have on campus, to try and promote an alternative way of thinking about internationalization and global understanding beyond that mobility question. They also highlight the marketization of education, the way that the programs that students are able to participate in are very much part of that they're able to purchase these experiences, they're able to buy a particular experience, and the challenges of thinking about education in that kind of consumer orientation is problematic. So trying to equalize the playing field so that students who often argue, I would love to go overseas, but I don't have the money to do it, to try and create a better system of opportunity for diverse students. Some of the other key ethical principles they talk about around power relationships, the exploitation of host communities. One of the things that's not well covered in this research is the role that graduate students in particular, sometimes undergraduate students, play, some of the ethical practices of collecting data and doing research in international contexts. A lot of similarities with some of the international volunteering ethical issues. And of course, unethical marketing and advertising. And one of my colleagues was saying that, sometimes you walk into a classroom and at every seat there's a little flyer for some sort of volunteer sending organization, right? So there's a lot of marketing that happens, and institutions can take a stand on what they officially promote. And so in their guidelines, they really highlight the importance of only promoting those programs that meet what might be considered fair trade learning, or like a checklist of ethical practices for universities. So interesting, one of my colleagues at the University of Guelph, Lynn Mitchell, in the international office, she used to get calls, we have this organization, we'd like you to promote it on your campus, tell your students about it. So she had this huge checklist that she would go over and say, okay, well, do you do this and do you do that? And halfway through they were done, and there was no way she was going to promote that organization on campus. But the challenge is, there's so many of them. She says, I could spend my entire day, every day, just trying to vet these different volunteer sending organizations that are trying to sell their programs on campus. And so some universities have just taken the stance that they're not going to promote any of those kinds of programs unless they've got a long-standing partnership and know that they're nonprofit and so on. So there's these conceptual and analytical realities that I think are useful for thinking about the ethics of international volunteering. One is the invisible walls that we sometimes put up, and Ogden talks about it as never leaving the veranda, right? This idea that we're sort of just observing another culture without ever fully interacting with it. And now with, when I first started volunteering overseas, I communicated with home by doing this, writing letters, and waiting several weeks. There was no internet connection in Malawi. Eventually an internet connection came in, but I'd have to stay after work and hope that after 2 hours of trying to get a signal or whatever it was called, trying to get a line, that I would be able, that my email would go through, and it often wouldn't. So now there's this new form of this invisible wall that happens where we start to question, does anybody ever really leave home? Are you actually ever immersing yourself in another cultural context when you're constantly connected through your social media and your communities online? And so that's really changed the way that we think about, how we're having intercultural experiences. Learning as transaction, that in fact, there's a lot of reciprocity in the learning process that needs to be more carefully addressed. Exclusion of decision making. This is important from the perspective of the partner organizations in terms of who gets to volunteer abroad. And if there are any volunteer sending organizations or organizations that send interns overseas, you will know that the vetting process is very time consuming, and a lot of work goes into finding the right volunteer. And sometimes you just get the wrong volunteer for the placement, or it just doesn't work out for a variety of reasons. But a lot of work does go into the screening for those really reputable international volunteer organizations. The challenge is that these are still decisions that are being made almost exclusively by the volunteer sending organization. And so there has been some desire among the partner organizations to have more involvement in the selection of participants, but keeping in mind at the same time that they're also facing this burden of resources and time that come with a hosting of international volunteers and the time that goes into looking after them when they arrive. So resources that can be set aside for supporting the host organizations in that process of selection of volunteers could be really helpful. And then just finally, some of the ethical considerations and how we talk about, just to recap, when we're thinking, I'm starting to feel really low energy myself, so hopefully you're all here with me still. When we think about international volunteering, first of all, we have to stop conflating the diverse models and also stop privileging a lot of the Western perspectives that we're seeing in the vast majority of the literature. So in the international health electives literature, for example, one scholar at McMaster University talked about a scan that she did, and out of the 42 articles that she read about international health electives, only 4 of them actually provided insights from the host organization perspective. So there's still a very small amount of literature overall that's actually focusing on the host organization perspectives. I think this is something that needs to be addressed more, but it also needs to be done in such a way that allows the host organizations to have control over the kinds of questions that are asked, the kind of research that's carried out, and the way that that messaging is shared. So that collaboration can be really important in that process. Avoiding some of those simplistic and inaccurate storylines is essential. Having a much more deliberate focus on the partner organization experiences. And finding ways to collaborate in new research modalities. So whether it's scholar-practitioner collaboration, global North, global South researcher collaboration, and also combining modalities so that international volunteers are working much more closely with locally based volunteers to build capacity of their own local communities to be able to do the work after the volunteers leave. And so that's one of the biggest strengths that we saw, most effective aspects of international volunteer contributions came about when local volunteers were involved in the work that they were doing. So I have, if anyone needs some of the references to the findings from this, you can find the quantitative material to the themes that I spoke to in my points here. In a number of my papers, I brought a lot of copies of them too if anyone wants them. And anybody doing research on international volunteering in this crowd? You are? Great. Anyone else doing research on this or hoping to do research on international volunteering? If anyone's really keen, I'm happy to give you copies. I brought a few copies of the book for you to take. So if that's of interest, please come by and grab some of those. Thanks to the International Development Research Center and SSHRC for funding this research, and to the partners that I've worked with, and also the host organizations that are actively involved in the research, design, and delivery of information. So thank you. And questions, of course. Please ask questions. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you talk about gender inequality and role models going into areas. When you think of female international volunteers, we look at the helping professions. So whether that's medicine or social work or whatever. Do you see a difference in what is brought to the community if it's a female in a non-gender specific role, like a female in computer science, a female in engineering?
Yes.
So do you see how they could be a role model for females when you think about the male coming in and saying, do you see a difference, or have you listed that as a difference?
Yeah, so that's it. What's your name?
Mary.
Mary, are you what?
I am here because I love volunteering,
Uh-huh.
and I read about it online, so I'm
Great. Thanks for your question, Mary. It's actually, yeah, in fact, there's a lot of just small references to, things that come up in the transcripts. So, when the community sees a woman driving, for example, driving the organization vehicle, that's changed some of the attitudes about, what women can do. Or seeing a male volunteer nurse working in a hospital when they're only used to seeing maybe women nurses in the hospital. It just, it's one of those like, wow, mind blown. I never knew that happened. And that's normal, and you have male nurses and you have women driving, and so it opens up conversations, and it's just that exposure. I think it really has made a big difference. At least that's what's coming up in our transcripts.
Nice. Yeah. It'd be nice if that was the same, like in our culture. When you saw, it wasn't, wow, there's a female in computer science. Wow, there's a female engineer. Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Other questions or comments or experiences that you've had? Yeah, I'll take Shauna and then I'll come to you, okay? Okay, go ahead. What's your name?
My name is Annette. I'm a graduate student here at Dalhousie. So I have been trying to read a little bit about Canadian history when it comes to gender development. And then you mentioned the fact that the problem of imprecision and the lack of clear picture what these guys are going to do when they go to volunteer. But also fact, a few books I've read like Race Against Time by Stephen Baranyi, then Struggling for Effectiveness, and the history of Canada International Development Agency. It just shows that it is a national problem in Canada. There is lack of commitment to what you're sponsoring. There is lack of independence, like to choose. Where should I sponsor? Where should I put this emphasis? And then there's lack of interest itself. So if the government itself cannot commit, especially when it comes to gender, and instead rotates around gender, like into security, government, environment, and all that, there is no way I see the organizations trying to be as precise as they can be. So they would rather also go gender in the round, just like the system is running. So as much as we want these people to know, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at teenage mothers with obstetric fistula in Uganda. What do they go through? How does the system work? They would rather go around, let me look for pregnant women, let me go and see who has a large wound, and then I report all women in Uganda sick. They have large wounds, they are all teenage mothers, and you see? So it's like a big, huge challenge that everyone doesn't want to commit to something. Because Canada's policies are running away from health security, back to gender, then back to terrorism. Then it's like we try, it fails, we rebrand it, then we pick on something else, it fails, we give it another name to the next government, to the next arrangement, and something like that. And then when you mention something to do with image presentation, I follow you when on Instagram, they do the same thing. Kids who are putting up their milk in class. In my head, I'm like, even if it were a kid here, I don't see a 4-year-old putting his milk at lunch to take a selfie. So they are taking pictures. Kids are so happy they are having milk for lunch. We don't give milk in Africa for lunch. No, we don't. So this is totally wrong. And afterwards, after the kids are so happy, they're like, UN still needs funding to feed kids around Africa. We don't give milk. We give typical potatoes and something like that. So it's just like, and I'm so glad that you take the time to bring them down, to point them out, because it's like we are just doing this. And a lot of people are really losing their interest in funding side, because it's like, what are you even funding? How come the situation never improves for generations we are funding?
And I thank you, Annette, for that really insightful reflection on what's a much deeper layer to all of this too, right? And that is the sort of the changing priorities, the shifting commitments, and the challenges that poses for how we then scramble around to try and fit ourselves into boxes that we don't know if those boxes are going to be the same boxes in 2 years from now or 6 months from now. And I guess the question is, how does that impact our partner organizations too? Are they also then, they know that Canadian priorities might be these 3 things. They know that, Canada is very focused now apparently on gender equality, then they're creating requests for technical assistance and things that they think are in line with what we want. And so that raises questions about the communication and the actual true demand that might exist in those communities. So, and I think, right now the volunteer partner organizations, the Volunteer Cooperation Program is putting in their funding applications. They're all scrambling for what's now a smaller pot of funding for the International Volunteer Program, the Volunteer Cooperation Program. That funding has to now last for a longer period of time, a smaller amount of money. And they're trying to position themselves in line with what they think the government what the government priorities are. Those are in many ways clear, but also to really try and hit on some of the key themes that they think will make their proposal more successful than the organization that is also putting in a proposal. So that it really changes the genuineness of the work that we want to do and the kind of sustained impact that we want to see over long periods of time. So really just to say that your points are very valid and they speak to much more deeper challenges that we also have to be addressing at the same time. And you highlighted some really great books there too. Yeah. I'm sorry, I looked at both of you at the same time. So I'll start with you because I saw you first and then in behind, okay?
I was just wondering about the money that it takes to send people over. That, I can kind of come into terms with going overseas can be ethical in the practices, but it's just I'm going with Engineers Without Borders to work for a solar panel company, but the money that it's costing to send me and the money for me to be able to eat and live and transportation is that's the part that's getting me to is there better ways, and in general volunteering.
Yeah. So you have to do what you're comfortable with, but I can tell you what we asked that question. The question we asked was, if you could choose to have the money that comes, the money that's associated with the amount of the cost of travel, or having the international volunteers without that cash, which would you choose? And overwhelmingly, the partner organizations say, we want the international volunteers to come. We know it costs money and we know that those are resources that could actually have a positive impact on work that we're doing. But the collaboration, the partnerships that we build, the potential for ongoing commitment and dedication of the volunteers when they go home, the promise and potential that it brings, and also the rich learning experience and the value that's associated with that interaction. So I think, they're not thinking about it in dollar terms, they're thinking about it from this sample anyways, they're thinking about it in terms of how it enriches their lives and how it helps them stay dedicated to the work that they're doing and build they hope, I think that's not always the case, but the hope is to build a lasting relationship. And through e-volunteering, you're seeing a lot more people who've come back from international volunteering having much more sustained impact and participation in an organization's work because of the technology. So whatever you're comfortable with, you have to do, but at the same time, I want you to know that our findings suggest that that's not about the cash.
Yeah, I was going to say, this isn't a question, just a very similar note. More experientially, working for a nonprofit for a couple of years, I think the traditional model of charity and sending money lacked a humanness, and really shifting towards more of, like you were saying, the solidarity and the human connection is what brings value and sustainability to the work, much more than just sending money to a problem. So I've had a very similar experience.
Great, thanks for that. All right, I'm sorry, your name was?
Kenzie.
Kenzie, all right, and your name?
Nafisa.
Nafisa.
Thank you for your talk. I've been researching your work for a while because Dr. Black and I actually looking at the difference between the liberals and the conservatives in this whole feminist foreign policy and the feminist, how Trudeau is super different from the Harper government, etc. I'm wondering.
Super different, super similar.
I was just
There's arguments to be made on both sides.
Which brings me to my question: how much faith do you have in this Trudeau's feminist foreign policy? How different is it from the Harper government,
I've looked at, because I'm looking at maternal newborn healthcare, and I've looked at the Muskoka initiative and like what Trudeau is doing right now. The numbers are all the same, everything is the same. So is it just like PR who's really good at that?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out what is actually different about this. Is it actually gender and development, or is it the same as women in development in terms, like analytically and theoretically? What's the difference?
So thank you for that comment, and I'm sure you've had plenty of conversations with David Black and have a good sense for some of his own critiques on this, and we've even worked together on some of this. I guess it depends on what you're looking at. Like if you're looking at it in terms of the way that Canada's branding itself, there are some similarities that you can see, and so David and I have just written a piece on that that's coming out really soon. There are lots of similarities that one can argue, and in fact I would say that while it's a feminist international assistance policy, feminism is never defined, and we have to remember that there's all kinds of feminisms. And I think the feminist approach that's quite clear in that feminist international assistance policy is a liberal feminist kind of approach. I don't think that that's entirely the case, and I think that there's some spaces in there where you can see something a bit more transformational, a little bit more cutting edge, a little bit more meant to, challenge structures than maybe we've seen previously. But what I think is important to remember is what my colleague Heather Smith and I have heard from some of the practitioners in the feminist community, in the NGO feminist community, who've said that a feminist international assistance policy, it may not be perfect, but that gives us an opportunity to walk into those offices at Global Affairs Canada and sit down and to hold them accountable and say, you've got a feminist international assistance policy. So what is it, what difference does it make? I think it depends on how people are able to use this strategically to their advantage. Whether it's, changing the kinds of programming overall, this remains to be seen. We're going to have to look at what kind of programs got funded under the FIAP. What are the how have measurements changed? There's supposed to be, a new way of categorizing the measurements and the coding of gender equality programming to look at, and that'll take many years to really discover. So I would say that in many ways it's more of the same, of course, and I think that's something that you're probably grappling with too. There is, we want it to be different, and it kind of feels different. And there's a lot of positive things that I think that come with opening up that kind of conversation. But at the same time, there are a lot of similarities. So I guess it's really about how people are using it, and using it for very strategic or transformational purposes that I think matters at the end of the day. Yep.
So I could ask you a ton of questions, but I know there's no time for that. But I kind of wanted to make a few comments and ask questions. So regarding the issue of cross-cultural engagement, this is something that I've thought quite a bit about recently, because this is a justification I hear a lot within my field, which is speech-language pathology. We're, as a field, a bit late to the game of voluntarism and international volunteering and all that, but it's exploded and it's severely problematic in many ways. And that's a justification that's made very often. But I think, but at what cost? Okay, so our students get to go and have this, cross-cultural engagement and learning experience. But do we look at what potential harm they're doing while they're getting that experience? Mm-hmm. And is it worth, is the cost benefit of both sides really worth that? You can just go travel and have cross-cultural engagement.
Yes.
You don't have to be volunteering, and good intentions are not enough.
Yeah.
So, and that issue is where I really see, people don't recognize good intentions are not enough. Mm-hmm. So those issues concern me, and I just wondered if you had any other thoughts of that. But let me just say,
maybe do you have your other question written down that we can come back to?
Yeah. Okay.
So it'll be easier than me remembering.
Okay.
So what's your name?
Ellen.
Thanks, Ellen. I think I guess I would just throw back, in a conversation style, what's the pre-departure training look like for your students? There's so many different pre-departure programs that exist at the University of Ottawa when students do internships overseas as part of their academic credit and or co-op experience. They participate in a 3-week intensive experience where they're actually reading some of my stuff, and they're reading, you know, some of the really critical literature and Barbara Heron's work and all of this stuff, and they're really grappling with some of these concepts to the point where some of them are like, I wish I'd read this earlier because I could have made a more informed decision, but I've already bought my ticket and now I'm going, and I'm a little bit, you know, I'm a little bit wary of the kind of impact I actually might have. So it's really on their mind. If it's the typical university, you know, do you have your health insurance, and do you have your anti-malarial, like that very simple pre-departure, which is not really about the ethics at all, right? Then, you know, then that's on the weaker side. So I think that a good pre-departure and a return orientation is also important for students to be able to dig deep and think about what it is they're doing, and to prepare them better so that they are not doing, so they're doing less harm at least, and doing engaging more positively in their experiences. And your next question?
In my department, we don't have any kind of international experience for our students, but I'm talking about what I read and presentations that I go to when I go to conventions, and you know, there's more and more and more presentations from, you know, university programs who are doing this, and you know, and I go to these presentations and sometimes I just sit there cringing the whole time. But anyway, and to be honest, I've been to presentations at Dal by students who returned from international internships, and I cringe and go like, wow, that was paternalistic.
Oh yeah, there's a great quote. One of my favorite quotes from the research is a Zambian woman who was in Canada, and she went to a talk as this returned international volunteer was talking about her experience in Zambia. And she said, I didn't recognize the Zambia she was talking about in that presentation. Like, there was nothing like, you know, that's not what my home country is like. And so it's a really interesting reality check too, for sure.
Well, there was something like that here a number of years ago where there were a number of people in the audience from the country that was being talked about. And afterwards I said to some of them that I knew, why didn't you say anything? And they just shook their heads. Where do you begin? Like, you just can't.
Yeah, yeah.
So on your point about conflating diverse models of international opportunities, I'm assuming you're talking about like, you know, something like going and volunteering at an orphanage for a week versus being involved with BSO or something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if I interpreted you correctly, but I kind of felt like you glossed over a bit of the severe ethical problems in that, like going and volunteering at an orphanage for a week, and the level, the amount of that sort of thing going on, that it's like exploded as an industry. And what I also volunteered in Malawi, and in all the countries that I've been in, I've seen a lot of really disturbing things. And when I was in Belize, speaking with the director of special education, asking her, you know, is it helpful when volunteers come? How do you want people to come? What do you want us to do? You know, she said, well, nobody ever asks us that. They just show up and do whatever they want. So.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to have more conversations about it, but just a really very short response to that is, you know, and this conversation came up this morning in an earlier presentation I did. There are problems, like orphan tourism, that volunteerism model with orphans is huge. Like, some of these examples are just completely unethical and have to stop. Absolutely, that's not even on the table. But there are some where, you know, people are paying a large amount of money to do cultural tourism that they call volunteerism, and host organizations say, yeah, you know, we use that money, they bring in money, we're not going to turn it down. We navigate these problematic structural arrangements in ways that benefit us as best as we can. While simultaneously we need to work at dismantling those problematic approaches to doing international volunteering, they're not going to go away quickly. So in the meantime, I think, you know, people are just making the best of those experiences. But I do have hope, because I think if we can transform and the Australian government can say, you know, orphan tourism is not acceptable. we will not let our organizations engage in these kinds of activities. I think that there's a lot of possibility for taking that. There's a lot of pressure right now on medical health electives as well, a lot of work to really make sure that only ethical practice is taking place in those kinds of volunteer placements. So I do have some hope as we move along.
We've almost run out of time, but I think Shauna has one last comment.
Just one comment, and I'm glad you ended with a piece around hope, because I do think that there's been significant change in how international experiences have been viewed over the past 10 years that I've been involved, and I see changes here at Dalhousie with mandatory pre-departure and health programs, accreditation standards that have thinking about the ethical implications, particularly in the medicine world. But one piece I think from a research lens that we need to think about as we move forward is this focused a lot on the student side. We don't often talk about the faculty side. And I teach, I'm involved in many theses, but I also see many faculty who should be here to hear at this talk, right? And we often have our focus on the students, but there's another level that we've kind of neglected in the conversation, particularly in the research. So I throw that out there for us to think about and reflect on, but I also throw that out there as a potential, maybe we could chat later.
Yes, happy to. Very interesting intervention.
And in the spirit of being positive about things, I do see some medical faculty here, which is really good, as well as a whole lot of other people. So really, I think, Rebecca, the wonderful thing about this is that it brought 3 groups of people together, the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and I'm actually the Global Health, the Director of the Global Health Unit in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and obviously IDS and the Global Health Office. And I think that means that there's a future for us all working together to try to figure out what we should or should not be doing and how to look at this, for me as a clinician, in a more academic, thoughtful way. So I really, really appreciate your comments, and thank you very much. I got the bag at the IWK. That's very nice.
It's a symbol of transformation.
Yeah. Thank you very
Thanks so much.
much.
It's a pleasure.